back to the study of the fruit of the Spirit, the path that leads to loving as Jesus loved. My name is Steve Langford. I'm the author of the book, and I am your guide on this study. The premise of the book is that in the 9 character traits the Apostle Paul described as the fruit of the Spirit, Paul laid out for us a path that we can walk that will lead us to loving as Jesus loved in the power of the Spirit. The first character trait is the trait of love. The goal of the Spirit's work in our life is to empower us to love as Jesus loved. The Spirit is at work in you. The Spirit is at work in me to empower us to love as Jesus loved. That is the goal. That is the objective. Now, the word that the Apostle Paul used in this text is the word agape. You're familiar with that word. It is the word that is used to describe God's kind of love. It is a love that is other-centered, that focuses upon the other and what the other needs, rather than upon self and my needs. It is a love that is self-giving, that is willing to give of self at great cost for the sake of the other. And so it is a love that is expressed in a servant spirit. It is a love that uses its power on behalf of the other, to walk alongside of the other, to respond to the other's need, to empower the other, to help them come into the fullness of their own maturity and their own growth. It is a love that is unconditional. It is not about deserving. As long as we operate out of a mentality or thinking of merit, of what a person deserves, we will never love as Jesus loved. We will always be evaluating. We will always be determining whether they deserve or not, whether they measure up or not, whether they qualify or not. So merit-based thinking will never lead us to love as Jesus loved, because God's kind of love and the love that with which Jesus loved is unconditional. That's why we use the word grace to refer to it. It sees beyond the behavior in order to address the need that is beyond. And seeing what lies beyond the behavior, seeing the underlying need, then we respond to that need to address it and to touch the hurt so that the person's life can be changed. Love. Love is the goal of the Spirit's work in our life. Jesus emphasized this kind of love, and the Gospel of John records that in the upper room experience, in what is called John's Book of Comfort, Jesus washes the feet of his disciples in order to communicate with them, in order to teach them about this kind of love, where we move beyond jockeying for position and fighting for what is ours, to be concerned about helping the other discover. And in that context, John records that Jesus says this, John 13:34. I give you a new commandment, that you love one another just as I have loved you. You should also love one another. By this, everyone will know that you're my disciples if you have love one for another. The distinguishing mark of the followers of Jesus is to be able to love as Jesus loved. And the Spirit is working to empower us to love that way. The identifying mark that sets us apart from everyone else, that marks us as the followers of Jesus, is this ability to love with God's kind of love. To love as Jesus loved. But obviously, loving as Jesus loved is a very daunting challenge. It seems beyond our capabilities and our abilities. And so what we often do, what we generally do, is to quit trying to love as Jesus loved and we substitute something else. We substitute something else to identify us as the followers of Christ. In Western Christianity, the thing that we use to identify ourselves as Christians is our belief. We believe certain things about Jesus. We believe certain things about the Bible. We believe so that our beliefs become the identifying mark. Or we also would add to that morals, these standards, these codes of behavior that by which we identify what is right and wrong, what is acceptable and unacceptable. And in addition, we use our religious involvement as evidence that we are Christians, or we use our involvement in charity of giving to those that we consider less fortunate than us. But the thing each of these substitutes have is that it is something we can do in our own power and in our own strength. We don't need God. We don't need the Spirit to help us to live out of those behaviors. We have control over them. And another dimension of these things, these substitutes that we use, is that we can do them, but it leaves our heart unchanged. It does not help us grow into the likeness of Christ. It does not address those areas of our life that block our ability to love. To love as Jesus loves is not something that we do in our own strength. It is something that we do in the power of the Spirit. It is something we do as we walk the path that Paul outlines in the fruit of the Spirit, so that we put ourselves in a position for the Spirit to empower us to do what we cannot do in our own strength. To love as Jesus loves is the distinguishing mark of the followers of Jesus. There can be no substitute for that kind of love. Now, the arena in which love is expressed is in relationships. In a specific relationship, often a relationship that is challenging and difficult, a relationship in which there is stress and conflict, we love in a specific relationship with a specific person in a specific situation at a specific given time. When we are called to love as Jesus loves, it is not about loving 24/7. It is about loving in the specifics. Now, the problem is relationships are one of the most difficult dimensions of life. It is one of the most challenging dimensions of life. We've already seen that reality in what Paul referred to as the works of the flesh. Do you remember how many of the works of the flesh had to do with broken relationships? When he speaks in Galatians 5:19, he speaks of enmity and strife and jealousy, anger, quarrels, dissensions and factions and envy. My guess is you've experienced those kind of things, that you have experienced in your life relationships that are difficult, that are full of conflict, and maybe even relationships that are broken. Have you ever considered why we live with such broken relationships? Paul reminds us that when we live out of our default human nature, that self-focused, self-serving nature, that it produces these kind of broken relationships. But that self-serving spirit that is driven by anxiety and by irritation and anger changes the way we view the other person. We view the other person as a problem. We view the other person as the source of the problem. We view the other person as an adversary. We view the other person as wrong. And out of that way of viewing them, out of our own self-interest, we automatically follow a universal pattern, a predictable pattern of behavior. Let me show you what it looks like. first step of the pattern is that we become irritable and impatient. We look at the other and see how they are not measuring up to our expectations. They're not doing things the way we believe they ought to be done. They're not doing what we want them to do. And so we become irritable, impatient with them. And in doing so, then, we become critical and judgmental of them. We find fault with them and with what they're doing. And in that spirit of being critical and judgmental, in that finding fault attitude by which we look at them and treat them, then we withhold any sense of sympathy, understanding, attempt to understand their perspective. We withhold any sense of compassion, any sense of forgiveness. And as we withhold, we withdraw from them. We emotionally draw back from them, or we simply avoid them altogether physically. We withdraw from them. And the way then that we think about them, and the way that we speak about them, and the way that we treat them is hard and harsh. I invite you to think about any relationship in which there is strain and stress and see if this pattern does not play out in your own experience. They fail to measure up to your expectations and you become irritable and impatient. You become critical and judgmental as you withhold any sense of understanding, compassion, as you withdraw from them emotionally or push them away, cut them out of your life, as you think about, speak about, and treat them with hardness and harshness. Now, the reason I identify that as a universal pattern, a predictable pattern of human behavior when we're living out of our default human nature, is because the Apostle Paul described the opposite as the work of the Spirit. For what the Spirit does is empowers us to be patient rather than impatient and irritable. The Spirit empowers us to be kind rather than critical and judgmental. The Spirit empowers us to be generous. The fruit of the Spirit is generosity. We are generous in the way we respond to the other, in our concern about the other, in our interest of the other, in our willingness to seek to understand their perspective. We are generous in giving our compassion. We are generous in giving our attention. We are generous in giving our willingness to hear. And so rather than withdrawing from the relationship, the Spirit empowers us to be faithful. The fruit of the Spirit is faithfulness. So that the way that we view them and speak of them and treat them is with gentleness. Gentleness means that we use our power to touch in a way that does not leave a mark, that does not cause pain, that does not leave a bruise. To love as Jesus loved is to love in the specifics, not 24/7. In a specific relationship in which there is difficulty, in which there is struggle. To love as Jesus loves is to love in a relationship where our anxiety is high, where our frustration and irritation and anger have been stirred. Those kind of relationships provide for us the opportunity for the Spirit to help us exercise self-control, put ourselves in a position for the Spirit to move us beyond our anxiety and fear into peace, beyond our irritation and anger and frustration into joy, so that out of that peace and joy we can choose how we will respond in that relationship. We choose to respond with patience and kindness and generosity and faithfulness and gentleness. In other words, we choose to love as Jesus loved in that situation with that person in that relationship dealing with that issue. It's a lot easier to live out of the flesh. It's a lot easier to live out of our old, predictable pattern of human behavior. But all it does is destroy relationships and rob us of joy. The Spirit wants to move us beyond the ways of the flesh, to transform that default nature. The Spirit wants to guide us on a path that will empower us to love as Jesus loves in the power of the Spirit. Well, it's time for you to share now in your group, to turn back to your group, to process the information, to process the truth that you heard, and in doing so then to personalize it. What kind of insights grow out of the truth that you've heard? What kind of insights into yourself or into a specific relationship does the Spirit bring? Because it is at that point of insight that the Spirit wants to be at work in your life to transform and to heal, to move you away from the ways of the flesh, the default human nature, into the ability to love as Jesus loves. So process, personalize, and share among yourselves, and then pray with one another as you deal with the implications of these great truths. And then we'll gather again for another study in which we'll look at the Spirit, the internal disposition out of which love flows. But until then, I pray for you the peace of Christ.